August 21st, 1985. A warm summer afternoon in Schuylkill Haven, Pennsylvania. A small, close-knit town about 75 miles northwest of Philadelphia, where everyone knows everyone, where children ride their bikes freely through quiet neighborhoods, and where parents never imagine the worst could happen. On this particular Wednesday, 3-year-old David Wellington Reed kissed his mother goodbye, climbed onto his prized 5-speed bicycle, and pedaled away from his home. He was just weeks away from his 14th birthday. He had brown hair, blue eyes, and a smile that lit up every room he entered. His friends knew him as quiet but friendly. His teachers remembered him as an outgoing student with big dreams. David wanted to fly, not just as a passenger, but as a pilot. He dreamed of soaring through the clouds, of leaving jet trails across the sky, of touching the stars themselves. His 7th-grade teacher, John Zuber, would later say of him, "There will forever be one less jet trail in the sky." But David Reed never came home that day. And what followed would become one of the most haunting cold cases in Pennsylvania history. A mystery that would take 23 years to solve, and a truth more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. This is the story of David Wellington Reed, a story of innocence lost, of secrets buried, and of a family's relentless pursuit of justice across more than 2 decades. Let's go back to that August afternoon. Picture it with me. The year is 1985. Ronald Reagan is president. Back to the Future is playing in theaters. Madonna and Duran Duran dominate the radio waves, and in Schuylkill Haven, a quiet Pennsylvania coal town with a population of just a few thousand, life moves at a slower, more innocent pace. David Reed wasn't just any 3-year-old. He was a paper boy, known for riding his bike through the neighborhood making his rounds, responsible, reliable, the kind of kid who showed up when he said he would. He attended Schuylkill Haven Area Middle School, where he was in the 7th grade. He played basketball. He rode his bike everywhere. And he carried with him those big dreams of becoming a jet pilot. But David Reed was also a kid growing up in a complicated home situation. His father had died when David was young. His mother struggled. The family, by some accounts, had been looked down upon in the small town. Some family members had issues with drugs. It wasn't the picture-perfect American family, but David's relatives loved him fiercely. He had 2 siblings, his brother James and his sister Virginia. When David left home around noon on August 21st, he told his mother he was going for a bike ride. A normal occurrence, nothing suspicious. Just a teenage boy enjoying a summer day before school started again. But as the afternoon stretched into evening, and evening turned to night, David didn't come home. His mother, growing increasingly worried, waited. She paced. She looked out the window. And when the darkness settled in completely and her son still hadn't returned, she did what any terrified parent would do. She called the police. Later that same evening, David's bicycle was discovered under a railroad bridge on Caldwell Street, about 3.5 blocks from his home. His prized 5-speed bike, the one he loved so much, abandoned. As his Aunt Judy Adams would later ask the question that haunted the family, if this boy liked to ride his bike, why wouldn't he take his bike with him? The police began their investigation. In a small town like Schuylkill Haven, a missing child was extraordinary, terrifying, the kind of thing that doesn't happen here. Neighbors were questioned. Friends were interviewed. Theories began to emerge. Had David run away? He was 13, after all, an age when some kids rebel, when some kids strike out on their own. But those who knew him said this didn't fit. David wasn't a runaway kid. Had he been taken by someone? An opportunistic predator? But there were no signs of a struggle where his bike was found. No witnesses had come forward with any suspicious sightings. The investigation faced another challenge. the family's reputation in the community. Some investigators initially dismissed concerns, according to later accounts from the Reed family, because the family was looked down upon in the town. It's a dark reality of how investigations can be influenced by bias, by assumption, by the way society judges certain families as less worthy of urgent attention. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Summer faded into fall, and fall gave way to the bitter cold of a Pennsylvania winter. And still, no sign of David Reed. His mother waited. His siblings waited. His aunts, uncles, and cousins waited. The entire town held its breath, wondering what had happened to the boy who loved to ride his bike and dreamed of flying. Then, 4 months after David disappeared, on December 15th, 1985, the wait came to a horrifying end. Picture a cold December day in 1985. The woods between the railroad tracks and a cemetery at the Schuylkill Haven and Cressona border are bare, the trees stripped of their leaves, the ground hard with frost. According to one account, a man searching for his lost cat ventured into these woods. What he found instead would haunt him forever: a human skull, partially buried in leaves and debris. But here's where the story takes its first truly bizarre turn. The person who reported the discovery to police was a 20-year-old local man named Joseph Geiger. According to his own account, his 2 pet dogs had been bringing bones home from the woods over a period of 3 to 4 months. Geiger claimed he had no idea the bones were human until his dogs brought back a human skull. Think about that for a moment. For months, this man's dogs had been retrieving human remains, and only when a skull appeared did he realize what was happening. It's a detail that seems almost impossible to believe, yet this was the story he told police. When investigators arrived at the scene Geiger led them to, they made a discovery that would devastate the Reed family. There, in the woods, less than 100 yards from David Reed's home, and only a few hundred yards from Joseph Geiger's own residence, they found a skeletal remains, with scraps of clothing still clinging to the bones. The remains were positively identified as David Wellington Reed. The 3-year-old boy who had left home on his bicycle 4 months earlier had been dead all along, lying in the woods mere yards from his family's home while they waited and prayed for his return, while his mother looked out the window hoping to see him pedal up the driveway, while his siblings wondered where their brother had gone. But identifying the body was only the beginning of a deeper mystery. Because the remains were so badly decomposed, and because forensic technology in 1985 was so limited compared to today, the medical examiner couldn't determine how David had died. County pathologist Richard Bindi performed an autopsy but found no definite cause or manner of death. The advanced state of decomposition had obscured any potential trauma. The manner of death was listed as undetermined. On January 21st, 1986, just over a month after the discovery, forensic anthropologist Alan Mann from the University of Pennsylvania examined the remains. Looking at David's bones and teeth, and considering statements from family members that the boy had lost weight before his death, Dr. Mann proposed a theory. David may have died of complications from undiagnosed juvenile diabetes. It was a theory that seemed to make medical sense, but something about it didn't sit right with investigators. As one officer would later recall, they never quite believed it, because there were too many unanswered questions. Why was David's bike found 3.5 blocks from his home, but his body discovered in a completely different direction? Why would a boy who supposedly died of diabetes be found in the woods rather than at home or seeking help? Why would he leave his beloved bicycle behind? And there was something else, something even more disturbing: the location of the body. Less than 100 yards from David's home. Joseph Geiger, the man who reported finding the remains, lived only a few hundred yards away from where the body was discovered. Because Joseph Geiger was the one who led police to the body, and because the official cause of death was listed as undetermined, neither the authorities nor David's family suspected Geiger of foul play. In fact, in the twisted irony of this case, some people viewed him sympathetically. Poor guy, finding a dead child's remains like that. How traumatic for him. But the Reed family couldn't shake their doubts. They couldn't accept the diabetes theory. They knew David. They knew something wasn't right about this entire situation. David Reed was laid to rest at Schuylkill Memorial Park Cemetery in Schuylkill Haven. His family gathered to say goodbye to a boy who would never grow up, never fly a plane, never leave those jet trails across the sky. The case remained officially open, but with no clear cause of death and no evidence of foul play, the investigation went cold. By 1986, the file on David Wellington Reed was gathering dust. His family was left with nothing but questions, grief, and a gnawing suspicion that the truth had been buried along with their beloved David. For nearly 2 decades, the Reed family lived in limbo. Imagine that existence. Imagine burying your child, your brother, your nephew, without ever truly knowing how or why he died. Imagine the questions that must have plagued them every single day. David's mother carried this burden until her own death in 2000. She died without answers, without closure, without justice for her son. His stepfather followed in 2005, also never learning the truth. And then there was Virginia Reed Meadows, David's sister, who became one of the most vocal advocates for keeping the investigation alive. Virginia actively encouraged police to continue looking into her brother's death. She refused to let David become just another forgotten cold case statistic. She pushed, she questioned, she demanded that someone, somewhere, figure out what really happened to her little brother. Tragically, Virginia died in 2007, just 1 year before the truth would finally emerge. Like her mother and stepfather, she never got to see justice for David. By the early 2000s, the Reed family had shrunk considerably. David's father had died when David was young. His mother, stepfather, and sister Virginia were all gone. The only immediate family members remaining were his brothers, Joseph Reed, who had moved to Fort Myers, Florida, and James Reed, who lived in Ohio. Joseph Reed, in particular, became a voice for his deceased brother. In interviews, he would describe the agony of not knowing, the decades of wondering, the slow erosion of hope. He told reporters he had given up hope of ever learning the truth. After all, 20 years had passed, 2 decades. Most cold cases that go unsolved for that long stay unsolved forever. But in 2005, something shifted. The 20th anniversary of David's disappearance was approaching, and a state police investigator named Trooper Robert Bednar decided to reopen the case. Bednar, who had been stationed at Schuylkill Haven, believed that new forensic technology and fresh interviews might finally unlock the mystery. Science had advanced dramatically since 1985. DNA analysis had become more sophisticated. Forensic anthropology had made tremendous strides. Methods for analyzing skeletal remains had improved exponentially. Bednar began conducting new interviews. He tracked down people who had been in David's orbit in 1985. He spoke with family members, friends, acquaintances, anyone who might remember something, anything, that could shed light on the case. And slowly, carefully, piece by piece, a very different picture began to emerge. A picture that had nothing to do with juvenile diabetes and everything to do with drugs, violence, and a deadly secret that had been kept for 20 years. People began to talk. In a small town, secrets have a way of festering. Guilt has a way of eating at people. And as Bednar interviewed more individuals, a name kept coming up again and again. Joseph Geiger. The same Joseph Geiger who had reported finding David's body. The same Joseph Geiger whose dogs had allegedly brought home bones for months. The same Joseph Geiger who lived just hundreds of yards from where David's remains were discovered. In January 2008, nearly 23 years after David's death, investigators made a crucial decision. They petitioned the Schuylkill County Court of Common Pleas for an order to exhume David's body. County Coroner David Dutkovich requested the exhumation, arguing that new evidence suggested foul play had been involved in the death. Judge Jacqueline Russell granted the order, writing, "Non-scientific evidence uncovered in the much more in-depth investigation conducted by Trooper Betnar, as compared to that previously performed by the police after the 1985 disappearance of David Wellington Reed and the discovery of his remains, indicates foul play was involved in the death of the decedent." On January 24, 2008, David's body was exhumed from his grave at Schuylkill Memorial Park. For David's remaining family members, particularly his brother Joseph in Florida, this was both painful and hopeful. Painful to disturb their loved one's rest after so many years, hopeful that science might finally provide answers. The remains were sent to a renowned forensic anthropologist. Using technology that hadn't existed in 1985, experts re-examined every bone, every fragment, looking for clues that the original autopsy had missed. And this time, they found something. Evidence of blunt force trauma. Evidence that contradicted the diabetes theory completely. Evidence that pointed to a violent death. Armed with this new forensic evidence and the testimonies Betnar had collected, investigators now had what they needed. They had enough to make an arrest. And on August 21, 2008, exactly 23 years to the day after David Reed disappeared, state police made their move. Picture the morning of August 21, 2008. Joseph Geiger, now 43 years old, is living in an apartment in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, just a few miles from where David Reed died 23 years earlier. He's unemployed. According to police, he's been using methamphetamine and hasn't slept for days. Geiger steps out of his apartment, probably thinking it's just another day. But Pennsylvania State Police are waiting for him. Officers approach. Handcuffs click into place. And after more than 2 decades of freedom, Joseph Geiger is arrested for the murder of David Wellington Reed. When police inform him of the charges, third-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence, Geiger's first words are, "I didn't do it. I didn't admit to nothing." But Geiger does something that tells investigators everything they need to know about his guilt. He immediately tries to shift the blame. He points the finger at John Fry Jr., who had been 14 years old in 1985 and was now 37. The police don't believe Geiger's attempt to frame Fry, because they've already interviewed Fry, and what Fry told them opened the floodgates to the truth about what really happened on August 21, 1985. Let me take you back to that day one final time, but now with the full truth laid bare. David Reed didn't just leave his home for an innocent bike ride. The investigation revealed that David, despite his age, had been involved with marijuana. His siblings had been using it from young adolescence. The family, as some had suspected, had issues with drugs. David himself had even been dealing marijuana in 1985. On that August afternoon, 3-year-old David rode his bike to meet 0-year-old Joseph Geiger and 4-year-old John Fry Jr. at an abandoned railroad caboose near the local train station. This wasn't unusual. Geiger had supplied the boys with beer and marijuana before. It was a hangout spot, a place where they could drink and smoke away from prying adult eyes. But on this particular day, Joseph Geiger had something on his mind. He believed that someone had been stealing his marijuana plants. Geiger, a small-time drug dealer, grew cannabis illegally near his home, and someone had been taking his plants. Gaia suspected David Reed. According to John Fry's testimony to police, the three of them were in the caboose, drinking beer and smoking marijuana, when Geiger suddenly confronted David about the stolen plants. David, just 13 years old, was facing down an angry 20-year-old man. What happened next occurred in seconds, but would reverberate for decades. Without warning, Joseph Geiger stood up and punched David Reed in the face with tremendous force. The blow sent David flying backward. His head slammed into the metal wall of the caboose with a sickening crack. David crumpled to the ground, unconscious but still breathing. John Fry, the 14-year-old witness, was shocked and terrified. Geiger turned to him and told him to leave. Intimidated by the older man, Fry fled the scene. He would later testify that he had no idea Geiger had actually killed David, and he didn't participate in what came next. What came next was a cover-up that lasted 23 years. Geiger left David lying unconscious in the caboose for about 20 minutes. He would later admit to authorities that he panicked, assuming David was dead. Medical experts would later conclude that if Geiger had called an ambulance at this point, David Reed might well be alive today. The head injury, though severe, wasn't necessarily fatal if treated immediately. But Geiger didn't call for help. Instead, he made a choice that sealed David's fate and his own. Geiger returned to the caboose, picked up David's unconscious body, and carried it a few hundred yards into the surrounding woods in Cressona. He found a spot not far from his own home, less than 100 yards from the Reed family's house. He laid David's body down and covered it with leaves and branches. And then Joseph Geiger walked away, leaving a 13-year-old boy to die alone in the woods. David Wellington Reed, the boy who dreamed of flying, never regained consciousness. He died in those woods, buried under leaves, while his mother called the police and searched frantically for her missing son. He died while his bicycle sat abandoned under a railroad bridge. He died while the entire town wondered where he had gone. Over the next 4 months, as David's body decomposed in those woods, Joseph Geiger went about his life. He interacted with David's family. He acted normally around the community. When he encountered David's brother Joseph on the street, he would say, "Hi," like nothing had happened. Joseph Reed would later tell reporters, "I wish I knew back then what I know today." And then there were Geiger's dogs. For 3 to 4 months, they would venture into the woods, where their owner had hidden a body. They would return home with bones, human bones, David's bones. Was this truly accidental, as Geiger claimed? Or was it part of a calculated plan? Police would later speculate that Geiger allowed his dogs to scatter the remains, making the death look like an accident, making the body harder to identify, destroying evidence. In December 1985, when the dogs brought home a skull, Geiger knew he couldn't hide it any longer. So he did something that showed both cunning and audacity. He reported the discovery to police himself. He played the role of concerned citizen. He pretended to be shocked and helpful. And it worked. For 23 years, it worked. But truth has a way of emerging, especially when investigators refuse to give up. The new interviews conducted by Trooper Betnar revealed damning details. People told police that David had admitted to stealing Geiger's marijuana plants. A sister-in-law testified that she had seen David with marijuana and smoking it. She confirmed that there was significant drug trafficking in the Reed household. Other witnesses came forward with even more disturbing accounts. One person told investigators they had seen Geiger nervous and crying on railroad tracks, saying, "I didn't mean to hurt him." Another witness reported being with Geiger when David rode past on his bicycle, and Geiger said, "I hate that kid," referring to the marijuana plants. When forensic experts re-examined David's skull in 2008, they found evidence of the blunt force trauma that matched exactly with Fry's description of David hitting his head on the metal wall of the caboose. The force of the impact had been enough to fracture David's skull. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was consistent, and investigators could now prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Joseph Geiger had killed David Wellington Reed over stolen marijuana plants and then spent 23 years lying about it. When news of Geiger's arrest broke, the reaction from David's family was a complex mixture of relief, vindication, and profound sadness. Joseph Reed, David's brother, spoke to reporters from his home in Florida. "The feeling is hard to describe," he said. "After all these years, I never thought it would come down to this. You give up hope." State Police Sergeant Craig Stein, commander of the Schuylkill Haven barracks, summed it up simply, "We got him." District Attorney James Goodman noted that while the investigation had wound down recently, it wasn't a total coincidence that the charges came on the anniversary of Reed's disappearance. "I thought it was appropriate," he said. For David's surviving family members, particularly his cousins who had kept his memory alive, the arrest brought mixed emotions. Pam Russell, David's cousin, expressed what many felt. "We always had a feeling that Joe Geiger had something to do with it, but now we had the proof. We knew 100%. But there was something else the family had to grapple with. David's body still hadn't been reinterred after the exhumation. Joseph Reed told reporters, "The next thing I would like to see is my brother back in the grave." Joseph Geiger initially pleaded not guilty, but as the evidence mounted against him, his legal position became increasingly untenable. 6 months after his arrest, on February 26, 2009, Geiger changed his plea. In Schuylkill County Court, before Judge John Domelakes, 43-year-old Joseph Geiger pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter, abuse of a corpse, simple assault, and tampering with evidence. As part of a plea agreement, prosecutors dropped the most serious charges: third-degree murder and aggravated assault. The plea agreement was controversial. Some felt it was too lenient. Others understood it as a pragmatic way to ensure conviction without the uncertainty of a trial. During the proceedings, Assistant District Attorney A.J. Serena presented the facts of the case. Prosecutors didn't believe Geiger intended to kill David Reed, but medical experts confirmed that if Geiger had sought help immediately, the brown-haired, blue-eyed teen might have survived. Serena also revealed a disturbing detail about Geiger's behavior over the years. He used to visit David's grave. He even got a job at the cemetery where David was buried. Was this genuine remorse, or was it something more sinister? Was Geiger keeping tabs on the investigation, making sure his secret stayed buried? "I think there's a sense of relief for Joe Geiger," Serena said, suggesting that the burden of guilt had weighed on Geiger for more than 2 decades. Geiger's public defender, Christopher Hobbs, argued that his client had been haunted by what he'd done. "I think, given what he admitted to today, it's a fair sentence," Hobbs said. But when Judge Domelakes handed down the sentence, there was an audible gasp in the courtroom. 1 to 2 years in state prison. With credit for time already served while awaiting trial, Geiger could potentially be paroled in as little as 6 months. For David Reed's family, the sentence felt like a slap in the face. This man had killed their 3-year-old family member, hidden the body, lied about it for 23 years, and he was getting 1 to 2 years? Pam Chappell, David's cousin, didn't mince words. "I'm totally disgusted with him. It's not something that can be forgiven." She clarified that while she didn't believe Geiger meant to kill David, he absolutely should have sought help. "I'm glad he finally took responsibility at last," she added. "But the sentence doesn't compensate for our decades of not knowing how the boy died." Another cousin said Geiger showed no real remorse during the proceedings. Corporal Robert Bednar, the investigator whose persistence had finally cracked the case, stated plainly what the evidence showed. David might well be alive, if Geiger had called an ambulance instead of panicking and hiding the body. In the end, justice, in the legal sense, had been served, but it felt hollow to those who loved David. How do you quantify 23 years of lies? How do you measure the pain of a mother who died without knowing what happened to her son? How do you compensate a family for 2 decades of anguish? Pam Russell, another of David's cousins, perhaps said it best. It's always going to hurt, and there's always going to be that hole there. But at least now we know, and David can rest peacefully. Joseph Geiger served his sentence and was released. He's somewhere out there today, having spent more years lying about David's death than he did in prison for causing it. The case of David Wellington Reed would eventually gain national attention. It was featured on an episode of Cold Case Files on A&E Network titled The Bone Keeper, a reference to Geiger's dogs bringing home David's remains. Corporal Betnar, who had worked so diligently to solve the case, said he hoped the show would honor David's memory and give hope to others with unsolved cases that difficult cases can be brought to resolution. Today, David Wellington Reed rests in Schuylkill Memorial Park in Schuylkill Haven, Pennsylvania. His grave marker bears his name, his dates. January 17th, 1972, 7/2 to August 21st, 1985, and serves as a reminder of a young life cut tragically short. The story of David Wellington Reed is more than just a cold case that was solved. It's a story about the fragility of life, about how a single moment of violence can reverberate across decades. It's about the importance of never giving up, of investigators like Robert Betnar who refuse to let cases gather dust, who believe that every victim deserves justice no matter how much time has passed. It's also a cautionary tale about the drug culture that can ensnare even children, about adults who prey on young people, and about how easily a life can be snuffed out over something as meaningless as marijuana plants. David Reed was 13 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. He wanted to be a pilot, to touch the sky, to leave his mark on the world. Instead, his life ended in a railroad caboose over a drug dispute, and his body was hidden in the woods by someone he thought was a friend. For 23 years, Joseph Geiger lived with his secret. For 23 years, the Reed family lived without answers. For 23 years, justice waited. When it finally came, it came too late for David's mother, his stepfather, his sister Virginia, and so many others who died, still wondering. But it did come, thanks to persistence, advances in forensic science, and the courage of witnesses who finally told the truth. There will forever be one less jet trail in the sky. David Wellington Reed never got to fly his planes, but his story soars as a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of truth, and the enduring love of a family that refused to forget. Call to action. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the unsolved cases in your own community, or the importance of never giving up on justice, I encourage you to take action. First, share this story. Cold cases are solved when people remember, when information gets out there, when witnesses finally come forward. If you know of an unsolved case, don't let it fade into obscurity. Keep talking about it. Keep the pressure on law enforcement to never close the books on justice. Second, if you have any information about any unsolved case, no matter how small or insignificant you think it might be, contact your local police. You never know what piece of the puzzle might be the one that solves the mystery. John Fry's testimony, decades after the fact, is what finally cracked the David Reed case. Your information could be someone else's breakthrough. Third, support organizations that help families of missing persons and cold case victims. These families live in a special kind of hell, not knowing what happened to their loved ones. Support groups, advocacy organizations, and investigative resources can make a profound difference. Finally, remember David Wellington Reed. Remember that behind every cold case statistic is a real person, with dreams and hopes and people who love them. David wanted to fly. He never got that chance. But by remembering him, by sharing his story, we ensure that his life meant something, that his death wasn't in vain. Thank you for listening to the story of David Wellington Reed. May he rest in peace, and may we never forget the importance of seeking truth and justice, no matter how long it takes. If you found this story compelling, please share it with others. Leave a comment about your thoughts and subscribe for more deep dives into cases that deserve to be remembered. Together, we can ensure that no victim is forgotten and that justice, even when delayed, is never denied. Rest in peace, David. The sky is yours now.